A fist came down on the chapel door and shoved it open. Boots scraped across the floor. A big man walked toward the coffin alone. Behind him, a dog limped on 3 legs, nails clicking against wood. He set his hand on the polished lid and stopped. The rows of folding chairs behind him sat empty, every single one. No flowers but the ones he'd paid for. No voices. No brothers. 40 years he rode with men who swore they'd bury each other, and not one of them came. His name was Roy Kowalski. They called him Diesel. He lowered himself into the front pew and waited for people who would never arrive. Then a young woman in a diner apron slipped through the door and sat down beside him. What could a stranger possibly know about the woman he'd loved for 40 years? Stay with me on this one. Roy didn't turn to look at her. Not right away. He'd walked into that chapel expecting a crowd and found nothing but cold folding chairs, and after an hour of that, a man stops expecting anyone at all. He was 71 years old, still big through the shoulders, though time had bent the top of him forward, the way it bends every man who spends a lifetime leaning into wind. His hands were scarred. His beard had gone white. He wore his leather cut over a black suit that didn't fit him anymore, because the last time he'd put that suit on, a leaner was alive to zip the jacket and slap his chest and tell him he cleaned up just fine. The cut meant something once. Iron Saints, the patch read. 40 years of road under that leather. Roy had ridden with those men through blizzards and funerals and 3 wars worth of grief. He'd pulled brothers out of ditches. He'd stood over graves with them and passed the bottle and made the promise every one of them made. Nobody rides alone. Nobody buries alone. And here he was, burying alone. He looked down at his boots. Marbles, his old pit bull, was pressed against them, breathing slow. 3 legs. Somebody had thrown that dog out of a truck on the highway years back, left him for dead in the gravel. And a leaner had made Roy stop the bike and carry the broken thing home in his jacket. She named him Marbles because he'd lost a few, she said, and so had they, and that made them a good match. The dog had loved her more than he loved Roy. Everybody had loved a leaner more than they loved Roy. That was just how it worked. Now here's the thing you have to understand about a leaner Kowalski. She was small, barely came up to Roy's chest. Quiet voice. Gray hair she kept in a braid. If you saw her at the grocery store, you'd have walked right past her. But that woman had a spine of forged steel, and she'd spent 45 years keeping a rough man pointed in a decent direction. She never raised her voice. She never had to. When a leaner looked at you a certain way, you sat down and thought about what you'd done. 2 weeks ago, her heart just stopped. In her sleep. No warning. Roy woke up next to a woman who wasn't there anymore, and he'd been half a person ever since. He'd called the brothers himself. Sat at the kitchen table with the old phone list and dialed every number he still had. Some were disconnected. Some rang and rang. A couple got answered by younger voices, sons and grandsons, who said they'd pass the message along. And a few he'd actually reached. Old preacher, Tank, Dice Malone, who'd been his road captain for 20 years. He told them the day and the hour and the name of the chapel in Ash Fork, this little played-out mining town in the high desert where he and a leaner had come to grow old and quiet. Every one of them had gone silent on the line, a long, strange silence, and then some version of the same thing. I can't make it, Roy. I'm sorry. I just can't. He hadn't understood it. He'd sat with the dead phone in his hand and turned it over and over, trying to figure out what he'd done. 40 years, and they wouldn't cross a county line to help him put his wife in the ground. He'd decided they must be old and tired and scared of their own funerals. That was the only reason a man could stand. He was wrong about that. He just didn't know it yet. So he sat in the front pew of an empty room with a 3-legged dog and a closed casket, and he waited because he didn't know what else a man was supposed to do. The pastor had come and gone, said his piece to nobody, and slipped out the side door. The organ music had stopped. It was just Roy and the silence and the weight of a promise that 40 years of brothers had broken all at once. That's when the door opened again, and the young woman came in. She couldn't have been more than 25. Dark hair pulled back, still in her work clothes, a pale blue diner uniform, an apron tied at her waist, a name tag she hadn't taken off. She'd been crying, or she was about to. She walked up that aisle slow, like she wasn't sure she had the right, and she stopped at the end of Roy's pew. "Mr. Kowalski," she said. Roy looked up. He didn't know her face. In a town that size, that was strange. "Do I know you?" "No, sir," she swallowed. "But I knew your wife. Can I sit down?" "Can I tell you something?" And Roy, who had nothing left to lose and no one left to guard against, just nodded. She sat. For a moment neither of them said anything. Marbles lifted his head off Roy's boots and looked at the girl, and this stopped Roy cold. The old dog dragged himself over and put his chin on her knee, easy as anything, like he already knew her. That dog didn't do that. Not for anybody. Not even for the mailman he'd seen 1,000 times. The girl reached down and scratched behind his ear without even looking, like it was a thing her hand already knew how to do. "My name's Callie," she said. "Callie Vance. I work at the Copper Spoon out on Route 89, the diner." She pressed her lips together. "Your wife came in every Tuesday for 2 years. She always sat in my section, booth by the window." Roy stared at her. Every Tuesday. 2 years. Alina had told him she went to her women's group on Tuesdays, over in the church basement in the next town. Cards and coffee and gossip, she'd said. He'd never once thought to check. Why would he? You don't check on the woman you trust with your whole life. "She never told me she went to a diner," Roy said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it. "I know," Callie nodded slowly. "She wouldn't have. That was kind of the whole thing about her. She kept it quiet." "Kept what quiet?" Callie looked at the casket for a long moment. Then she looked back at Roy. "Every Tuesday," she said, "your wife would come in and order the same thing. Grilled cheese and tomato soup and a coffee black. And every single time before she left, she'd point at some other customer, somebody she'd never met, a trucker, a mom with kids, an old man eating alone, and she'd pay for their whole meal. Anonymous. She'd make me promise not to tell them who did it. 2 years. Never missed a Tuesday. Never once said why." Roy sat very still. He knew his wife was kind. He knew that better than he knew anything. But this was a secret life, laid out right in front of him by a stranger in an apron, and it was only just starting to sink in that there were rooms inside Alina he'd never been allowed into. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because that's not the real reason I came," Callie said, and her voice cracked right down the middle. "There's something you need to know. Something she never told you, and I promised her I'd be the one to say it." Roy felt something cold move through his chest. "You promised her?" "Before she died." Callie's hands were shaking now. "I need you to hear me all the way through, Mr. Kowalski, because it's going to hurt. And then I really hope it's going to help." The chapel was so quiet Roy could hear the clock on the back wall ticking. He gripped the edge of the pew. "Say it," he said. But Callie didn't. Not yet. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out something folded and worn soft at the creases, a diner receipt, the paper gone gray from being handled too many times. She held it in both hands like it might blow away. And she took a long breath, the kind you take before you jump off something high. "2 years ago," she said, "a woman I'd never seen before walked into the Copper Spoon on a Tuesday afternoon, sat in my section, and she watched me the whole time I worked. Not creepy, just watched, like she was memorizing me." Callie's eyes filled. "When I brought her check, she caught my wrist, real gentle, and she said, 'Honey, what's your mother's name?'" Roy didn't move. "I told her my mom's name was Marie Vance, And this little gray-haired woman she went white, like she'd seen a ghost. She let go of my wrist and she said she was sorry and she left a tip that was more than the meal cost 3 times over and she walked out to the parking lot. Callie wiped her face with the back of her hand. I watched her through the window. She sat in her car for almost an hour, just sitting there, crying. I didn't understand it. I was scared for her, honestly. But she came back the next Tuesday, and the one after that. Marie, Roy said. The name meant nothing to him, he was sure of it. He turned it over and found no place it fit. Who's Marie? Callie looked at him, and her face was full of a terrible tenderness. The look you give someone right before you hand them something that's going to break them. My mother, she said, and your wife's daughter. The word landed in that empty room like a dropped glass. Daughter. Roy heard it and his whole body rejected it, the way a body rejects a lie. Alina couldn't have children. She told him that on their third date 46 years ago, sitting on the back of his bike watching the sun go down over the desert. Told him plain so he could leave if he wanted to because some men wanted sons. He'd said he wanted her, and that had been the end of it. They'd built a whole life around that one settled fact. No children. Just the two of them, and later the dogs and the road. That's not possible, Roy said. His voice didn't sound like his own. She told me she couldn't have. She was 17, Callie said softly. It was before she ever met you, way before. She had a baby girl and her family made her give it up. Signed the papers in a hospital in Tucson and never got to hold her. And she was told, this is the part that matters, Mr. Kowalski, she was told that the birth had hurt her inside, that she'd never carry another one. Callie's tears were falling freely now. So when she told you she couldn't have kids, she wasn't lying to you. She believed it was true. She just left out the reason. Because the reason was a grief she'd buried so deep she didn't know how to dig it back up. Not even for you. Now stop for a second, because I want you to understand what was happening to this man. Everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd slept next to for 45 years was coming apart in his hands. And he wasn't angry. That's the thing that surprised even him. He wasn't angry. He was just flooded. 45 years of a woman crying in the bathroom with the fan on so he wouldn't hear. 45 years of her getting quiet every October and never saying why. He'd thought it was just her way. He'd thought he knew all her weather. He hadn't known a thing. If you're still with me, and I hope you are because it only goes deeper from here, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one about the things people carry in silence, they don't get told unless folks like you stick around to hear them all the way to the end. All right, back to that chapel. How do you know all this? Roy asked. How do you know it's true and not just a story somebody told you? Callie unfolded the gray receipt in her hands. On the back of it, in handwriting Roy would have known blindfolded, small, careful, slanted to the right, were 4 lines. He leaned in and read them and his throat closed. For my Callie. So you'll always know. Find the big man with the white beard and the 3-legged dog. Tell him everything. He deserves the truth, and I was too much of a coward to give it to him myself. Love him for me. Alina. She wrote that 6 days before she died, Callie whispered. She gave it to me on a Tuesday. Told me if anything happened to her, I was to come find you and tell you the whole thing, start to finish, no matter how much it hurt. She said you were the strongest man she ever knew and you could take it. Callie folded the receipt back up and pressed it into Roy's shaking hands. So here I am, telling you. Roy held that little piece of paper like it was the last warm thing in the world. And for a long, long moment in that empty chapel, the strongest man Callie Vance had ever heard of put his face in his scarred hands and made a sound she'd never heard a person make before. Then it was quiet again, and Roy sat back, wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand, and did the most ordinary thing. He reached down and straightened Marble's collar, ran his thumb over the old brass tag, the way he'd done 10,000 times. The dog leaned into him. Roy breathed out slow. The worst of it, he figured, was over. The secret was told. He knew now. He could grieve it and carry it and someday make his peace. He looked at this kind young woman beside him and he almost smiled. "So," he said, and his voice was steadier. "You're he couldn't finish it. He tried a different way in. Aliner's granddaughter. You're Aliner's granddaughter." "Yes, sir," Callie smiled through her tears. "I guess I am." And for just a second, sitting there in the wreckage, the two of them felt almost peaceful, like the storm had passed, like maybe the empty room didn't matter so much now, because at least it wasn't all the way empty anymore. Then Callie's face changed. "There's one more thing," she said, and her voice dropped low, "and it's the reason nobody's here." Roy went still. "What?" Callie glanced back at the door, at the rows of cold chairs, at the whole empty chapel. "Your brothers," she said. "The Iron Saints, you think they abandoned you. I know you do. I can see it on you." She shook her head slowly. "They didn't. Aliner made them stay away, every one of them. On purpose." And just like that, the ground moved again. Because see, this wasn't about a kept secret anymore. This wasn't about a woman's private grief. This was about the last thing Roy had left, his belief that he'd been betrayed by the men he loved, and it was being pulled out from under him. "That's not," Roy started. "Aliner didn't even know most of those men. Half of them she never met. How could she?" "She wrote them letters," Callie said. "All of them, the last month of her life. I mailed some myself from the post office in town. She got their addresses out of your old road book, the one in the garage." Callie leaned forward. "She told them not to come, Mr. Kowalski. She begged them. She said she needed the room to be empty for 1 hour. She said she needed you to feel all the way alone just for 1 hour so that when I walked in and told you the truth, there'd be nothing else in the way. No noise, no crowd, no brothers slapping your back. Just you and me and what she needed you to finally know." Roy stared at her, and the enormity of it started to open up in front of him like a canyon. "She planned this," he said. "Down to the last piece," Callie said. "The empty room wasn't your brothers turning their backs. It was your wife, reaching out from 6 days before she died, arranging the whole world just so, one last time, so the truth would land soft instead of hard. So it'd come from family. So it'd come from me." Callie's chin trembled. "She said, and I remember it exact, she said, Roy's spent his whole life surrounded by loud men. This once I need him quiet enough to hear a girl he's never met." Roy looked around that chapel. The empty chairs. The silence he'd taken as the deepest wound of his life. And now he understood he'd read it exactly backwards. It wasn't abandonment. It was the most careful act of love a dying woman had ever built. Every cold folding chair was Aliner's fingerprint. She'd emptied the room the way you'd clear a table before you set down something you didn't want to break. "Those men," Roy said slowly, "Preacher, Tank, Dice, when I called them they went quiet on the phone, everyone, I thought." "They knew," Callie said. "They already knew. They'd all got her letter. And every single one of them kept their word to a woman most of them had barely met, because that's the kind of respect you know what kind she was." Roy sat back hard against the pew. The room spun a little. 40 years he'd worn that patch and believed the code was the deepest thing in his life. Nobody rides alone. And it turned out the code had bent, all of it, every hard old man of it, to the quiet request of a 5'0" woman with a braid down her back. They hadn't broken the promise. They'd kept a bigger one. "Where are they now?" Roy asked, barely a whisper. Callie stood up. She held out her hand to him. "She thought of that too," she said. "Come on, come outside with me. There's one more thing she wanted you to see." Roy got to his feet. His knees ached. His heart was somewhere down around his boots. Marbles hauled himself up on his 3 legs and stood between them, and the 3 of them walked down that long aisle toward the chapel doors, Roy's hand trailing along the backs of the empty chairs, understanding now that not one of them had been an insult. Callie pushed the doors open. The afternoon light came in hard and gold, and Roy heard it before he saw it. Engines. Not 1, not 5. A wall of sound rolling up the road toward the chapel, low and rumbling, the way thunder sounds when it's still miles off but coming fast. Roy stepped out onto the chapel steps and looked down the long straight road that ran through Ash Fork, and his knees nearly went out from under him. Motorcycles, dozens of them, rolling in from the highway in a long, slow column, chrome throwing the sun, patches on every back. The Iron Saints. And not just his own chapter men he hadn't seen in 20 years, men from 3 states, gray in the beard now and bent like he was, riding 2 by 2 up the road toward him. They'd been waiting. Out past the edge of town, engines cold, for 1 full hour, because a dying woman had asked them to give her husband 1 hour of silence, and then, only then, to come. At the front rode Dice Malone. Roy's old road captain pulled his bike up to the bottom of the chapel steps and killed the engine and took off his helmet, and his face was wet, and he didn't try to hide it. "Diesel," Dice said. His voice broke on the one word. "We're sorry, brother, we hated it. Every one of us hated sitting out there on that shoulder watching the clock, knowing you were in there thinking we forgot you." He shook his head. "But she wrote to us. Alina wrote to every man here, and when that woman asked you for something, you did it. You know that better than anybody." Behind Dice, the whole column was shutting down, 1 engine at a time, until the only sound left in Ash Fork was the wind and 40 old bikers climbing off their machines. They came up the road on foot. Preacher using a cane now. Tank wide as a door still, tears running into his gray beard. Men Roy had bled with. Men he'd been sure had left him to bury his wife alone. Every one of them had come. They'd just come at the hour she chose. And there in his hand, Roy was still holding that soft gray receipt. He looked down at it, "For my Callie. So you'll always know." And it hit him all at once, the whole shape of what Alina had done. She had spent her last strength making sure that the moment he learned he had a granddaughter, he would not be alone for even 1 minute afterward. She'd built him a soft place to land, and then she'd filled it with everyone he'd ever loved. She'd known she wouldn't be there to hold him. So she'd arranged the whole world to do it for her. Dice reached the top of the steps and pulled Roy into his arms, and the 2 old men held each other and shook. Then Tank. Then Preacher. One after another, 40 men wrapped their arms around Roy Kowalski, and every one of them, before they let go, leaned in and said some version of the same thing in his ear. "She told us. About the girl. About your granddaughter. We know, brother. We've got you." And each time, Roy looked over their shoulders at Callie, standing there in her blue diner apron with her hand on the 3-legged dog, and he understood that he had not lost his whole family in that empty room. He had gained the last piece of it. Somebody had brought flowers. Somebody always did. Tank's wife stepped out of a truck with her arms full of desert marigolds, and behind her came the wives and the sons and the grandkids, a whole crowd of them pouring out of the trucks that had been parked down past the tree line the whole time. Within 20 minutes, that empty chapel wasn't empty anymore. It was packed to the back wall. Standing room only. The overflow spilled out onto the steps and the gravel lot. Roy stood at the front beside his wife's casket, and this time when he turned around, the folding chairs were full, every single one, and there were more people than there were chairs. He got up to speak. He hadn't planned to. But he stood by the casket and put one big scarred hand flat on the lid, and he looked out at the room his wife had filled from beyond the grave, and he found the words. "I was married to this woman for 45 years, he said, "and I thought I knew everything about her." His voice caught. Turns out I knew about half. Turns out the other half was busy loving people I never even got to meet. Loving a daughter she lost before she found her again too late. Loving a granddaughter she watched from a booth by a window for 2 years because she was too scared to say the words out loud. Roy shook his head slowly. And loving me, planning all this. Making sure that, on the worst day of my life, the truth would come gentle, and I wouldn't have to stand in an empty room 1 second longer than she meant me to. He looked down at Callie in the front pew, where she'd sat down beside Marbles. "That's my granddaughter," Roy said, and his voice was fierce and cracked and proud. "Callie Vance, Marie's girl, Eleanor's blood, and I only just met her 20 minutes ago, and I'm never letting her out of my sight again." The room broke. Grown men wept openly, the way only very old, very tough men can weep, without any shame left in them at all. They buried Eleanor Kowalski that afternoon in the little cemetery on the hill above Ash Fork, with the whole desert laid out gold and endless below, and the wind moving through the sage, and 40 motorcycles parked in a row along the fence. The bikers carried her casket on their shoulders. Roy walked at the front. Callie walked beside him with her hand tucked into his elbow, and Marbles limped along on his 3 legs, refusing to be left behind, the way he always had. Marie's story came out slow over the weeks that followed, the way the hard stories do. Eleanor's daughter had grown up 200 miles away, never knowing her mother's name. She'd married a good man, had Callie, worked as a nurse. She'd started looking for her birth mother in her 40s, and she'd found her, but she'd found her the same year the cancer found her, and there wasn't time. Marie died before they could sit in a room together. Eleanor never got to hold the daughter she'd signed away in a hospital when she was 17 and scared and alone, but she'd found the granddaughter. And every Tuesday for 2 years she'd driven 40 minutes to sit in a diner booth and watch Callie carry plates and laugh with the truckers and live, just live, close enough to touch and never quite touched. Paying for strangers' meals because Marie, it turned out, had done the very same thing her whole life. It was the one thing of her daughter's Eleanor could still do. Keep the habit going. Keep a piece of Marie moving through the world. Roy sold the house in town. Not right away. But by that winter he'd moved into the little place out past the Copper Spoon, close enough that he could walk to the diner in the mornings and take the booth by the window, Eleanor's booth, and drink his coffee black and watch his granddaughter work. Every Tuesday, without fail, before he left, he'd point at some stranger and pay for their meal, and make Callie swear not to tell them who did it. Some things you inherit. Some things you keep alive on purpose. The brothers came around more after that. Ash Fork got used to the sound of engines. Preacher taught Callie to ride, over Roy's loud objections, and she turned out to be a natural, which surprised nobody who'd known her grandmother. On Sundays, the whole graying crew would ride up to the cemetery on the hill and stand around Eleanor's stone with their hats in their hands, and somebody would tell a story, and somebody would laugh, and the wind would move through the sage. And sometimes, when the others had gone, Roy stayed behind alone. He'd sit down in the grass by the headstone with Marbles pressed against his boots, the same way the old dog had pressed against them in that empty chapel, and he'd take out that soft gray diner receipt he carried in his breast pocket now, worn near to nothing, and he'd read the 4 lines one more time. He deserves the truth, and I was too much of a coward to give it to him myself. You weren't a coward, Elle, he'd say out loud to the stone and the wind and the desert. You were the bravest one of all of us. You just did your bravest thing quiet, same as always. He'd walked into that chapel believing he'd been left behind by everyone he loved. He walked out understanding he'd been held, the whole time, by hands he couldn't see. The empty room had never been an ending. It was Eleanor clearing the table one last time, so she could set down the thing she'd carried alone for 45 years and trust it, finally, to the man strong enough to hold it, and to the girl in the blue apron, and to a broken old dog who'd known her the second she walked through the door. Nobody came to the old biker's wife's funeral, and then everybody did. That was a leaner. Right down to the last minute of her life, she knew exactly what she was doing.